কাপে কফি দেওয়াটা লুকস ভেরি ফানি
ওই প্লেটে এরকম করে এরকম করে ওইভাবে
বলিস when you're ready
start the video.
Already recording. I was
so তাহলে take the click so that you know when to edit ক্লিকটা দেখে নাও
Welcome to University Adda. My name is Priyam Marik and today's special chat is dedicated to Republic Day. 71 years ago, on January 26th, the Constitution of India came into force, transforming India from a constitutional monarchy, which it had been since independence on 15th of August 1947, into a sovereign democratic republic, founded on the values of equality, justice, liberty and fraternity. In the 7 decades since, India's journey has been a complex and fascinating one. It has been a tale of remarkable highs as well as repulsive lows, of rights and righteousness, of regression and regeneration. And yet, through it all, India has managed to retain its status of being a republic. But the big question is, what does it really mean to be a republic? And perhaps more importantly, what does it really mean to be in a republic? Is it towards hope or is it towards despair that India's current fortunes sway? Standing in 2021, whose republic is it anyway? Welcome to this discussion, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's panel featuring some of the sharpest minds from the city of Kolkata. And I'll quickly start with the intros, starting from my extreme left. Yashroop Dey, who's an alumnus of King's College London, where he studied political economy. He's currently committed to various forms of creative authorship, copywriting, management of debate clubs, and of course, cynicism. Then we have Shireen Gupta, who is currently studying public policy at St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and her thesis is based on data and artificial intelligence governance. Then we have Shubham Chakraborty, who, in his own words, belongs to the indiscipline of English literature at Jadavpur University and is committed to the twin virtues of ideological promiscuity and professional troublemaking. To my right is Oishik Banerjee, who is a graduate of economics from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. He was part of the prestigious Lamb Fellowship for 2019-20, where he dealt with all things politics and parliament. Currently, he is a research associate on the political team of one of India's most senior MPs. And finally, we have Shomritha Datta, who completed her postgraduate in literature from Capital University. She's currently a writer and freelance journalist. So thank you to all of you for coming here today. Let me begin the discussion by giving a hypothetical scenario. So imagine that all of you are back in 1950 and you are part of the drafting committee that is going to prepare the Constitution of India. So essentially you are going to chart out the course for a new republic, create as it were the Indian dream. The question then becomes, whose republic would you make it? What are the values that you would instill in that republic? And how is that different to the republic that we actually got from the makers of our Constitution? So Soham, why don't we start with you?
I think 1950 was a time when I think there's a quote by Hemingway. I'll start with that. Hemingway has a quote where he says that like how did you go bankrupt, and he answers that by saying gradually and then suddenly. So we got our independence a bit like that. We got it gradually but then suddenly. And I think at that moment our founding fathers were wise enough to include many safeguards, fundamental rights, provisions which really matter today. But what really happened, the real story of Indian democracy started right about 16 months after the Constitution was passed, when Nehru introduced the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution. The First Amendment has often been called the Second Indian Constitution. It drastically reframed the rights in the Indian fundamental rights context. It completely changed the dimension of freedom of speech. It removed practically the right to property. We don't have a right to property anymore in this country. It severely limited, for example, preventive detention, and it also allowed for all the misdemeanors in the current political context that we see today. All of these are inheritances of the First Amendment.
Shireen, would you agree with that?
To a certain extent, I feel like, because you kind of had this thing, you just started a nation. So you couldn't always have this thing where people would be like, I need my rights, I need this. You have to understand that when we started as a nation, we had a lot of things to get through. You had a lot of rules to make, you had a lot of things to do, and sometimes you have people not agreeing with them. Even though you might say that retrospect, like, you look ahead, you think, that might actually be good for the nation. But you won't always have people who agree with it. If someone comes, if there's a certain rule that's supposed to be good, if someone comes up and says that's a violation of my rights, and this is happening, that is happening, maybe we'll file, we didn't really have PIL then, but if someone came and said, even that's wrong, maybe that we shouldn't do that, you wouldn't be able to build a nation to begin with. you'd have to have a certain amount of limitations to certain things, and then people actually trusted their government to a certain extent. It'd be like, okay, fine, we just got our independence, we need to make a new nation, and we still have reasonable restrictions to our fundamental rights.
Yashu, do you think that somewhere we put the cart before the horse in terms of creating a constitution for which the Indian society wasn't really ready?
Oh God, yes. Okay, so my thing with the constitution is, I think, as a constitutional framework, we borrowed a lot from the West without taking the context from the West, right? We were not rights, duties. These are things that philosophically mean different things depending on where in the developmental and industrial journey you are as a nation. In a nation where rights, and when I say rights, I don't mean rights vis-a-vis the state, I mean rights as personal beings in your homes, in your culture as well, right? Where we value undefinable cultural artifacts such as religion, caste, etc., or intangibles such as gender roles, etc., to such a high value. I feel the model of rights and duties that we downloaded from the West sound great, and they maybe are, right? But I think a certain amount of bedrock was needed before they could be realized. So, for example, to have a right to express religion or right to movement, etc., without addressing the power of movement versus, which essentially means who can move, right? So when you create a right to free movement within a country, etc., or property for that matter, right? We skip the conversation about what movement is for and who has the power to move and for what reasons. When we talk about like right to practice your own religion while being a secular state, it puts us in a very vicarious position where neither of the two things are defined, but they're open to definition depending on the times of that time, right? What being proud of one's life in a post-colonial context where a country is poor meant was not defined, right? And I think what happened with the constitution was we had great minds making it, and it was, I wouldn't necessarily make a different constitution per se. I think the constitution as is great, but I think we sort of assume that the constitution once made will fulfill itself without creating a bedrock for which we needed that constitution.
Kaushik, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, thank you, Priyam, for inviting all of us firstly. And I think I agree largely with what Yashu, what Shubham, Shireen have said, right? In 1947, 1948, when the freedom movement had reached the peak where the British were actually considering and had considered that India at that point of time, they had to let go of India needed that freedom, India deserved that freedom. I think the focus at that point of time was that India needed to be free. But our focus at that point of time should have been what India would have done with that freedom. And I think that was something that I wouldn't say, I'm not in a position to say that the likes of B.R. Ambedkar and the Constituent Assembly lacked that forethought. But I think what their main focus at that point in time was what kind of freedom do you want for India instead of what India would do with that freedom. And therefore the moment the constitution came into being, the ideas were what free India would look like. But they stopped or they failed to create that system where they could understand how to prioritize in the next 10 years or the next 20 years, right? They failed to have that vision of what India would prioritize in the next 10 or 15 years, which is why the moment you move to the 1960s, you had a problem of prioritization. You had a problem where agriculture was not given that kind of importance despite India having a comparative advantage there. Where Nehru tried his best to industrialize the country through, blocking borders, to trying to grow industries locally, it didn't work. So the bedrock, as Yashu said, was in place to create an India which was free of all evils, so to speak, of the last 200 years. But no one really knew what to do with that free India. And I think that would be the first thing that I would do. Create a system where you know what India would look like for the next 15, 20, 25 years. Instead of just saying that this is a free India, these are your rights and duties, and therefore go and do what you want to do.
I believe that the primary, I can't really say that how we could have done it differently, but I can analyze how it didn't work out that well, because the makers of the constitution visualized a nation before it was already there. So when we achieved our freedom, India was not really a nation. People did not know what nationhood was. Like several different demographics, a different culture. There's the issue of caste, there was the issue of religion. The partition happened because of this several different kinds of people living together, not knowing how to live together, basically. So the makers of the constitution were very ideological in that regard. They wanted to create a very ideal state for everyone, where they visualized that everyone would be living in unity and harmony. But that did not turn out so. So they made a constitution having something in mind, but the country, like the nation, shaped up something differently. So I think there is where the clash happened.
Fair enough. I think in many ways it's perhaps fair to say that the constitution that we got was perhaps one we wanted, but not necessarily one we needed at that point in time. I want to, before I move on to the different stakeholders of the Republic, quickly discuss the whole leadership issue and the impact certain leaders had in terms of their presence and also those in terms of their absence. So we know that Gandhi died in 1949, a year before the constitution was adopted. And also there was no Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who knows where he was at any point in time. So, do you think that the constitution we eventually got, to what extent was that a combination of the personality tussles between Nehru and Ambedkar? Because we know that they had significant differences in terms of the vision they wanted for the Republic. And perhaps, as a follow-up to that, what impact could a Gandhi being alive would have had on the constitution and a potential influence of Netaji? Because we spoke about this fact that Netaji's vision was, let's have a military dictatorship for some amount of time, 5-7 years, and then potentially we can transition. So maybe Puba, if you want to start off with that.
So here I think I've thought about this a lot. I think what happened with Gandhi dying and Netaji, well, who knows? But Netaji not being there is that Nehru instantly for some reason believed that for India to progress we need material returns. Like industrialization needs to happen before socialization of people needed to happen. So I feel like Gandhi, Ambedkar, Netaji focused on a provision-based government where services were allocated to people, where the government was paternalistic to a certain extent. They did not just create a right, but create an ambit for people to realize those rights.
A lot of people, they famously say that when India gained independence, the rupee was almost as strong as the dollar. And over the last 60 to 70 years, we've seen the kind of degradation that has happened. So whether or not it could have changed, we can't say. But that was definitely the beginnings of something that we see today in day-to-day society. And I believe one of the reasons was, as Yashu said, and as I believe that the government did not try to put enough safeguards in place at every level, right from the top all the way to the bottom to ensure the fruits of anything reached the poorest person in the country.
What's this, sir?
Yeah, you can start.
Cool. So I think Indian farming, first and foremost, when people talk about Indian agriculture, it is not a monolith. Agriculture in the East is not remotely similar to agriculture in the West, which is not similar to agriculture in the South. When we behave like the same policies for agricultural ease or whatever can work across the country, that is not true. Because in a lot of places like northwestern agriculture is very land ownership based, it's very, how do I put it, like it's more capital intensive and social capital with agriculture is higher in the northwest than it is in like poorer regions of Orissa or Bihar or West Bengal for that matter. Right? So when I look at and what I think about farming that has happened or agriculture that has happened today is I'm not even going to the farm bills because I think the farm bills is a symptom of a structural problem. Right? I think the farm bills are a result of letting the market operate in a very poorly structured way for like 30-40 years since the past, right? I think like not only, sure, you can argue that MSP was needed and I will also say that, but I think it's also the job of the government to not create dependencies on things like MSP. I think it's also the job of the government to, when we rapidly try to industrialize without trying to understand what industrialization can mean to agriculture. Right? So, can the benefits of industrialization flow horizontally? Are we looking to make farmers owners of industry, or are we looking to make farmers industrialized farmers?
India has always been basically a agrarian state, and it's to change that into something very capitalistic is like taking away the lifestyles of people that we have been accustomed to, which we have seen in the Shingud and on the land acquisition cases where they're trying to give the people a different lifestyle which they're not used to, and that will change a lot for them. So policies have never benefited farmers as such. There's always benefited a different class of people the farmers are very token for that. A lot of places exploited. So we have never put farmers in charge.
Let's talk about industrialists, what is going on in India. We know that we have certain A-listers, no pun intended, that are controlling the country in some ways. But where do you see it? Because for many years, India has been this new bright hope, this new thing that is going to come over and be the new Asian power. But really, where are we today in terms of our industries, in terms of actually incentivizing investment in the country? Shireen, why don't you start?
I feel like a lot of times when you talk about industries, you have this one company that's dominating everything. You have that one company that has monopoly over everything. For example, Reliance is there. They have a lot of things, they've invested in a lot of things, and whatever we have, as suppose a foreign alternative, we have an alternative in India, but it's by Reliance. You don't really have a lot of industrialists per se. You have one or maybe two industrialists who own these certain sectors. You also have people. For a lot of for example, industrialists also invest in think tanks and other things like that. Therefore, you take control of that as well. So you don't really have a lot of industrialists coming up, and people who actually do come but always crushed by people who already had the power for a very long time. So I feel like that is why we have not grown. For if you have this one industrialist that's crushing power, they will not do anything for they will not let anyone else interfere in that. They will control it to the best they can. They don't really care about the country, right? They care about their own selves, they care about their own companies. So you always have that. I think that is the reason why we don't really have a lot of development in India.
There is a difference between industry and there is a difference between capitalism. In the sense that a question about industry necessarily needs to be about who is industry for and who is industry by, right? So there's a difference between a firm which has industries getting a lot of profit. That is not industrialization. Industrialization is the process by which firms can accrue industrial units, right? In that sense, industrialization can be driven by the government itself, not necessarily by a firm. So when we talk about industrialization in the Indian context, I think at that moment, what are we talking about? Right, how has industrialization worked out for India, etc.? Where have the benefits of industrialization accrued? To that matter, again, you bifurcate industry into tangibles and portfolio industries, right? So things like
So in simple language, we differentiate it into companies which are oligarchic and companies which are coming up.
So perfectly
Speak
competitive
like
firms.
like just
Cool, sure. Yeah, so basically we're talking about like you have a bunch of oligarchs who are dictating the flow of capital, which is where you can have industrialization that is run by the state but controlled by the oligarch, Russia. Or you can have like industrialization was done by the Soviet Union and then like a bunch of Russian oligarchs came and like, okay, we'll take it from here. Similar like to post-91 liberalization in India, after the industrialization story came to a certain point, the last 2 decades or so of Indian industrialization has been corporatization of existing industry, right? The
it's
capital.
called cannibalism. So what has happened is people, existing industries are not innovating in the Indian context because the incentives for capturing the government are better. Here, if in a context where the state is not so powerful that firstly it can dole out so much power. Power needs power hates vacuums. Power needs a crevice that it needs to.
It needs an opposition.
Like it just needs to go somewhere. And in the context of India, where the state is so damn powerful, you are going to have a situation where the incentive for capturing the state is much better than innovating, which is also the story of globalization, by the way.
Also, capturing the state is not necessarily getting into politics. It's dictating how the state does politics.
I'll give you an example, right? Right now, for example, the companies which are, for example, Adani is a great example. Looked upon as a sort of a market success in India, huge market cap, etc. If you look at their debt to earnings ratio, it's terrible. It's a company that in any other context, without the kind of government support and with the kind of money that's been fueled into it, would never have been profitable to the extent that it is. It only exists in the context that India is in the form that it does, only because of the benefits that accrue out of state capture. So that's the real story. It's the same with globalization, by the way. Like when people think globalization as an efficiency increasing mechanism, that's not what it is. Globalization is a substitute for innovation. When you can't vertically innovate, when you can't improve sort of like the existing technology, and you can't have increase in the kind of quality of living purely through inventions and scientific discoveries, what you're going to have to do is cut costs in many other ways, which is how horizontally globalization has spread across the world. And that's the story of the 21st century. This is a concept called the Great Stagnation.
Yeah, I think like adding to what both Yashrup and Shom brought about it, I think the incentives in the Indian context are largely dictated by a kind of myopia in governance. And what do I mean by myopia in governance? Innovation usually has larger gestation periods for that matter. And therefore, the moment a government realizes that to innovate you need capital expenditure which has a long gestation period, you need education investment which has an even larger gestation period, you need to invest in R&D, you need to invest in skill development. All of that would need a government which is dedicated to improving a country 10-15 years down the line, instead of getting quick returns in 1 or 2 years down the line.
That's because of democracy. The point that you're trying to make is essentially that democracy shouldn't exist. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that democracy can exist and innovation for 10, 15, 20 years
How?
down the line can also
Explain
exist.
that though, Vaishali. It's easy
And
to
when
say
you-
in panel discussions like this, sit around and say let's plan for 15 years. If you are tomorrow in
I think you
government,
have to create-
no, if
you
you
have to
are in
create
government
a
with
system.
Trinamool Congress, like listen, if you are in government with Trinamool
You have
Congress
to
tomorrow,
create
how
a
will you have that
system.
situation? How will you
I would
handle
do
this?
this.
No, if you are the industry minister in a
See,
TNC
I
government,
wouldn't
how
expect
will
you
you
to
do this?
understand because you won't have the kind of access to people like I do, but I will not bring it about. I will not try to explain.
Are you asking us, do we know who your father is, Vaishali?
Oshi, complete your point and we move on.
Yeah.
Shy.
So the idea is that in India, industrialization has been going on at the expense of exploiting the already available resources that we have, labor and natural resources, so to speak. And the moment we stop investing in capital because we think it has this huge gestation period and we all keep exploiting resources for gains in the short run, we will not achieve the true benefits of industrialization in that long run. And the moment we stop doing that, the moment we run out of resources, which includes our labor and our natural resources, we'll realize we have nothing left to work with and we'll get stuck in that low level, middle level income trap, right? And which is which India is heading towards.
You have a point?
Yeah, I'm saying that in our country, we also have to see that industrialization is also largely political. So the government is also very driven by the profit motive. So the government is kind of kept in its place by these large oligarchs basically who are profiting. So and it's like both help each other. It's symbiotic that way. So therefore.
But on that argument, right? I mean, if both are profiting, then industrialization should still happen. No matter the reason.
Industrialization is happening, but it's only controlled by a few who are having.
Okay, if it's happening, but it's controlled by a few, what's the problem?
The problem is that
The problem is that those few will only see to their own benefits. So it's that a big part of the population will be left up.
But their
outside
own
from that
benefits-
Development. So development in its sense will not include the entire nation. So development will be largely for these few monoliths in power, which are looking for their own capitalistic, expansion.
I think
So-
what's important is to understand that the incentive right now is to make profits instead of understanding where those profits come from and where those profits go to. And I think there is the difference. And the moment you start focusing on the latter, that is where the benefits of industrialization will start
You
accruing.
need to see where profits come from rather than where they
No, I'm saying that at the moment the focus is on making the profit instead of understanding does that profit come from exploiting coal or does that profit come from using, say, solar power?
What Oishik is suggesting is essentially in bureaucracy, where my father works, it's essentially called a time and motion study. We have done about 50,000 of those, they are rotting in lockers, okay? The problem is none of this. The problem is essentially our excessive focus on egalitarianism. How, let's understand the excessive focus on egalitarianism that we have in India. Let's say we had a COVID-19 stimulus, which was said to be around 17 trillion, or really around 1.5 trillion. But regardless, it was a huge amount of influx of money into the economy. Why can't we do anything productive with that economy? Why doesn't it create productive assets? The reason why it doesn't create productive assets is that we in the government do not think like we are in a war. Think of how World War II played out, right? World War II plays out, and if a government needed to crack codes, you get the 100 best mathematicians in the country, you put them in a room and you tell them that you need to crack the code or we are in an existential crisis. That's how the Enigma cipher was cracked, okay? That's what the movie Imitation Game is also about. What the problem in our context is that because we are really focused on these egalitarian mechanisms, even if we push in an insane amount of money, it goes through the same processes, it goes through the same institutions. institutions, it goes to the same funding mechanisms, the same grant structures. None of that changes. So what you essentially do is that if there's like a sort of a 60-year-old, like somebody was
Far
once.
from egalitarian, being an egalitarian nation.
No, we are facing egalitarianism while not being
Yeah.
equitably
Yeah,
egalitarian.
So our motive is to be egalitarian,
Correct.
whereas the implementation is going in haywire.
But the problem is the intent.
But our
The
definition of
problem is-
egalitarian is also skewed.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Our
Right?
problem is in the sense that we are afraid of hierarchies in this country because of our history of
We are
being
afraid
oppressed
of
for a long time.
hierarchies.
Because we
We are creating those hierarchies.
How can we be
have
afraid
been
of
creating these
hierarchies?
hierarchies, right?
We function on hierarchies, right?
No, in fact,
And
we
we
are
are not
not in
afraid of
public
hierarchies.
acknowledging hierarchies.
You have to portray yourself as a savior of the people. You're not a people's
Yeah,
person.
you're
You
not
are
a
above
person.
them. You
have to-
represent them.
But you
Yes,
come
are
from the
nurturing
people
Yeah,
to save them.
It
You
depends.
are nurturing the people. You are like the father figure. You're the like
It
the
depends on the
patriarch out
context.
there.
It depends on the context.
But the
In
problem
South-
is-
in South Indian politics, you want to show your people's person. In North Indian politics, you want to show that
But
you as an
our
upper caste are the
nation-
representative of
But
all the
our
other people,
nation,
right?
in its general orientation, we want to be led. We want to have this big
This is-
father figure
think
nurturing
about-
us and fostering
think
us.
about how
so
this
the
affects
government,
the-
the person who is in power, is supposed to act like that. He's supposed to show that he's a people.
Guys, what I think is trying to be said here that we are a country that relies on that charisma of magnetic personalities.
Exactly.
Personalities who market themselves in such a way that they
Yes.
become this larger paternalistic figure
Yes.
without acceding to the fact that there are hierarchies that actually operate the system, right?
Mm.
So we need hierarchies without essentially being reminded all the time that we need hierarchies.
Not really.
No, Priyam, I think look at Prime Minister Modi's speeches, okay? Tell me at one point in this country's history where Prime Minister Modi gives a speech and it doesn't explicitly talk about equality in the people. There's no speech like that. He mentions it. The problem is that we are obsessed with this idea that if a reform happens, the benefits need to accrue to everybody equally at the same time. If we have
So
a policy
you say that
implemented.
if a reform happens, the benefit should not.
Can you give me an
Give an
example of
example.
a reform that has happened which has benefited everybody equally at the same time?
No, we can't.
Think of televisions. Who got televisions first in this country? The argument against, by the way, the argument against computers being introduced during Rajiv Gandhi's time was that they would, they take away thousands of jobs. For example, from people who used to man offices
so
and
you
be
mean to say that
clerks.
you need to be explicitly stating to the public that we need to function in hierarchies and
No, we need
there
No.
is someone
we need an aristocratic spirit which is
aristocratic spirit.
Yes, an aristocratic spirit which has aristocratic in the sense that this
So
is.
you saying that
But one thing I
Let me-
fundamentally
let me explain
like.
the democracy.
Let me-
Yeah, okay.
Because I made a because
Please explain.
yeah, let me explain the idea of an aristocratic
Can I
spirit.
show
This
you?
is not to do with sort of the material needs of aristocracy. This is to do with the.
Everyone in a democracy is not.
Let me
Let
complete
him-
this
let
point
him-
and I'll come back to it. So the aristocratic spirit that I'm talking about is essentially the ability and the willpower to go against majorities. That's what's lacking in India. There is no government, no leader which has the ability to come. They might try to do it in all sorts of bureaucratic, Kafkaesque ways.
The government who is in power, the government is the one who creates the trend in which the majority thinks. So if
Absolutely not. The
Wait,
government
also
is a
that
conclusion of the majoritarian
Yeah.
trend.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
sure,
not.
but the government, that is also not true. The government has a large responsibility in itself to also dictate and control the way in which the thinking majority
The government's
is going.
responsibility on paper and the government's responsibility to itself are two different things. The government's responsibility on paper is to lead.
Do you think it's important for a country to have the ability to speak anti-majoritarian truths? For example, let's take economic policy. There's an economic policy that we need that a country needs to implement, and the experts of this country, the people who are in the
I have
ruling
a
class, they think
question.
that they want to implement it and the benefits will
I
accrue.
have a question here. So you're
Yeah.
saying that.
But she hasn't come in. Right?
Yeah, fine. I'm asking it beforehand.
See, this is the problem with equality.
I'm asking it beforehand.
See, you are accruing time because you think you have a point to make. If we divided time equally in this system, everybody we
You
wouldn't
are
have the
speaking for
conversation.
hours. It's not that you are a great champion of equality. You're
I am
saying
not,
the
but
same
I
thing.
stated-
I can take the mic from you.
But I stated that explicitly.
It's fine. Somebody can ask a question and we'll go shoot.
No, definitely.
Fine. Anti-majoritarian sentiments in democracy, do you think they're valid or not?
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
But so
No, it depends on which arena you're talking about. Like on what end do you want to be anti-majoritarian? Because
Against the majority.
Again,
I think she means which
But
domain.
how do you define
political,
what
social,
the
economic.
How does that come from?
Okay, let me give you an example.
Let
Let me give you a historical example, right? You take for example the Indira Gandhi regime at the time when India.
Let's take this regime for example.
Well, we will take it on other accounts, but let's go back and take the Indira Gandhi regime. And the economic policies at that time for India were very much left wing, right? Which is why an economist like Subramanian Swamy had to leave the country. And he came back and he said that Amartya Sen actually promised him a job. Now, this is his narrative, so can't quote me on that. Amartya Sen had promised him a job, and then when he came back, Indira Gandhi was in power. By then, it was very much left wing economic policies. Amartya Sen told Swamy that look, there is no place for your right wing economic model in India today. So you leave. And essentially, we lost what would have been a very transformative economist. Today, whether or not you agree with what Subramanian Swamy says, he had a very different vision of India, which might have challenged the Amartya Sen school of thought. Now, Subramanian Swamy's vision at that time would have been an anti-majoritarian sentiment or anti-majoritarian idea against the left-wing policies of the government. So that is what we are trying to say, that in a democracy, yeah.
You're saying the majority is what most of the common people are thinking, right? That's how you're defining majority. So
Yeah.
where is this majority stemming from? Because when you're saying that during the Indira Gandhi regime, the policy was very left wing. So but the policymakers were not the people; they were a certain.
The people elected people who became
But
policy
they really
makers.
represent.
That's a different
the
Exactly.
people,
So
in the
here,
country.
so now here's something, right? You want equality, you want democratic principles, but you feel like you can question whether people truly represent or not. Which assumption do you break? Because you can't assume you can have democratic ideals at the same time continuously asking the question, but are the elected representatives true representatives?
I'll tell you
What is
the
a true
problem.
representative?
The problem here is that if there's an idea that an elected representative spouts that you like, and this is not with you obviously, it's with the general arena in the country. If he likes it, you think he's representative of the country. If he says something that you do not like, but he claims it represents his constituency and the majority, then you say, aha, but is that really what the majority thinks? So this is, in debating, we call this conditional pleading.
Yeah.
You are
So
pleading.
then we really need to define firstly what we mean by majority.
No, first you need to define what you mean by democracy or elected representation. Right, because as Indians we often throw around the word democracy like it inherently holds value. It doesn't. Democracy is a mathematical aggregation. It is easy and it sounds equal, right? But the second, I mean, if you have multi-party democracies, right, and this is to take that industrialization point as well, where you were asking, Oishik, do you want democracies or not? Sometimes you may not.
Yeah.
Because a multi-party democracy where
And I think the best example of this would be the kind of stratospheric growth which many South Asian countries achieved, right?
yeah,
You want Singapore.
dude, oh god.
Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore. for
There's
that
something
matter,
common between all of them though. Have you noticed?
You can enlighten me.
They are small.
Yeah,
the
that's
problem
also
is,
what I'm
the problem is the
And that is when you go back to 1950.
And also they are not as socially stratified.
Yeah.
You go back to 1950 and you say, do we want a federation of states? Do you necessarily
India shouldn't be
have
this big a
India-
country. India should be 4 countries. It's the size of like 4 or 5 countries in the
And that's
country.
when you go back-
India should operate like the European
Go back
Union.
and say that at that point of time, what were the fears that we had? You just can't stick at 1950 and then come to 2020, or you keep moving back and forth.
No, we had that option by the way. We had around 500 plus princely states in this country.
Yeah.
If we had democratized princely states and made them independent, sort of along a city-state model, we would have had like 1,000 different republics in this.
Like Hyderabad would be a country, like Singapore. It would be a nation state.
You would have Tebaga as a country.
Sikkim would be a nation state.
And
Yeah.
understanding that
Kashmir in
that places
Yeah.
like Uttar Pradesh, for example, need that kind of division in power to be able to function more
Yeah.
efficiently. is
No,
also-
but here's the thing. We are placing efficient functioning. We are okay. The importance we are accruing to it, it's great. But one thing we often do forget is that sometimes countries need to risk imploding and civil strife in order to reach a certain place.
The panel believe that India could have functioned like just as a trading bloc or just as an economic bloc. Like
Absolutely.
EU, right? And that's something we
Absolutely.
could explore.
Yeah.
Or could have explored. I mean, you have different.
We should have, because for some reason we felt like being one huge country and using the term unity and diversity, which I don't know what that literally
Where,
means.
where did that come from? I think it came from the fact, I think we were in this patriotic inertia where we came from a 200-year-long struggle together, right?
Forge an identity.
I come from, for example, Port Blair. Okay, I was born there. I lived most of my life there. Like if you look at Andaman Nicobar Islands and the tribal people who live there, they were not consulted. They were not consulted whether they wanted to be a part of India, whether they wanted to have their own tribal republic, whether they wanted. We didn't consult nomads about whether they wanted to be a nomadic state. Where we didn't consult, for example, the northeastern people. We didn't consult these people. So the idea is that
In fact, our partition was drawing a line on a map. Why don't we revisit that line? Okay, like if I am so educated,
It's not.
That's
it's
the
not
point.
possible.
We have to wrap up the segment. We have to wrap up the segment.
Hi guys, we hope you enjoyed this video. We certainly had a lot of fun making it. This is the first time that we created a podcast like this, shooting on a physical location, getting a panel of speakers to come together. Tell us whether you liked this format, whether you did not like this format, what you felt could have been different, what other subjects or topics you think we could have chosen under the theme of India's Republic, whether you agreed with the panel of speakers or disagreed with them. Do not forget to visit Conversity's website, whose link is in the description below. We at Conversity really want to explore this kind of format where we give young voices a chance to speak on the most important issues of our times in a manner that is enlightening, engaging, and above all, entertaining. So do tell us what other kinds of content, what other kinds of themes and subjects you would like us to address, because as content creators, your interests and desires are foremost for us. Till next time, do not forget to like and share this video and subscribe to our channel. Stay safe and take care.